Hello, this is Kylie with Fem and Flow. I hope you're all having a great day. So, today we're starting a new series called the Hijacked Blueprint, and we're starting at the beginning of this specific inversion cycle, the one that shaped our current world. So, over the next 2 weeks, I'll be dropping 4 episodes on Tuesday and Thursday. Like past multi-part series, I don't like to make people wait. I think it's so interesting and really good information, so I like to get it out sooner rather than later. So, I've talked about the Earth experiment before, but today's series goes even deeper into the spiral. And we're starting with the fall of coherence, the fall of memory, and what once was a unified Earth grid. We are going back to Atlantis, the Nephilim, and the original black hole distortion that set this whole game board into motion. If we want to understand what's happening now, we have to understand where it began. In this process of naming the inversions, we are also taking back the original blueprint and uncovering true history. While we have talked about some of this before, I really want to be thorough, so I'll be repeating some of it because it's really important and relevant when discussing this big picture. We'll start off by talking about the origin of the inversion, then retrace the truth throughout the eras, and ultimately end up talking about how we can actually restore the original blueprint now. So let's begin. To kick it off, let's talk about the black hole inversion, the first distortion of light. Before there were nations, there were templates. And Earth was seeded as a planetary node of multidimensional coherence. And so, what does that really mean? Earth was not random, it was chosen, intentionally placed within a designated polarity corridor of this universe, a region carved out from white hole coherence to explore embodiment through contrast. And the corridor was not broken, it was permissive, and this was set up. It was created to explore a sacred question: what happens when source consciousness is embedded in form, veiled from itself, and given the freedom to remember or forget? It's what we've talked about before when I talk about the Earth experiment and how the main question was, if we disconnect from source, can we find our way back? We've talked about that a lot recently. And when I say experiment, it wasn't a scientific experiment. It was more like a divine integration program, more like a harmonic spiral of opportunity for souls to embody, choose, fall, and return. So, when I say Earth experiment, what I really mean is Earth was a test site for source reunion and it was voluntary. And Earth wasn't the only place affected or in this divine integration program. This whole quadrant of the universe was carved out from white hole coherence to explore this embodiment through contrast. I've talked about this before, but what we're used to is the white hole realms, and we definitely don't have this. So it might feel foreign or really hard for us sometimes, but just know this is not the usual. So, Earth was encoded as a living library, a mirror of galactic intelligence, and its ley lines reflect the nervous system of a greater body, and its crystalline core hums with acoustic memory, and its elemental balance, water, fire, air, earth, and ether, is a five-fold interface for dimensional synthesis. But more on that. So, Earth was seeded as a coherence node in a polarity realm. So, in a universe of polarity, Earth was designed to be a place where the tension of opposites could give rise to conscious choice. So, love could be rediscovered through contrast, and unity could be chosen even through separation. And it's where you can go into this veil of amnesia and you could remember your light. And not because it was just a given or you naturally were connected to it, but because you could go through this process and with your free will decide to freely embody it. And this is what makes Earth unique. White hole realms live in harmony, but they do lack the friction that catalyzes self awareness. And then black hole collapse zones spiral in chaos, but they forget they ever had a choice. So Earth stood between that. And that's why so many advanced beings, lineages, and soul families have encoded their memory here to participate in the experiment, to see what happens when the divine chooses to wake up inside the density. But as we've talked about before, with free will and disconnection from God, polarity was no longer in balance and things began to spiral downward. Free will is absolutely sacred. It's part of what makes Earth a powerful and unique realm. But free will also comes with a risk, the ability to turn away from coherence. So at first, polarity served a purpose. We had light and dark, yin and yang, masculine and feminine. These opposites created dynamic tension that fueled growth, awareness, and deeper integration. But over time, as certain beings chose separation over unity, a feedback loop of distortion began to form. So, disconnection from source wasn't just philosophical, it actually became structural. And when conscious turns inward without anchoring upward, it begins to invert the flow of energy. Instead of receiving from God and giving back to life, some civilizations began to siphon, and to manipulate the field for control. And this marked the beginning of imbalance within polarity. And this was where darkness wasn't just contrast, it actually became a dominant pattern. Fear started to replace love as the organizing force, hierarchy replaced harmony, control replaced communion, and power replaced presence. And without remembrance of source, many forgot they even had a choice. They forgot their divine origin, they forgot the blueprint. And this forgetting, this inversion of identity, is what allowed the hijack to take root. Because when free will detaches from remembrance, it becomes vulnerable to outside influence. And that's exactly what happened. So we've talked about this before in depth in other episodes, but I'm kind of rewording it all here. But certain beings, like some of the original participants that fell into this distortion, we could call these fallen light beings or archetypal fallen angels. And then others who were born of this distorted light, these beings began to seed systems of control, parasitic technology, and frequency disruption across the grid. And they didn't just invade through physical war, they entered through consciousness, through ideas, wounds, and trauma and disconnection. And then slowly the spiral tilted. Earth became denser and denser, and the light got dimmer. And I've talked about this before, but that's when the polarity flipped into a black hole realm under black hole physics. But before it officially flipped, since Earth was a coherence node within the experimental quadrant of this universe, it was actually a spiral point and a redemption field. And it was a chance for integration, but it did come with its risks. So before I get there, I want to talk about a one little tangent. So we talk about this, but polarity is sacred. Masculine and feminine, light and shadow, day and night, it's all part of this dance. And I've been talking about it a lot recently on podcast and on social media. But when polarity is in balance, we can create. That is where physical creation comes from, but it needs to be in balance. And I've talked about how there's pure white hole realities where there's just pure source and it's all like the frequency of enlightenment, essentially. And then where you start to play with polarity, you do so still in a white hole realm. You just play with it and you can play within these different frequencies. But without remembrance, polarity tilts and can get imbalanced. And at first, contrast served its purpose. It created awareness. But over time, certain beings began to choose control over communion. They stopped receiving from God and began manipulating energy for power. And this inverted the natural flow of life. And as this forgetting deepened, Earth's spiral tilted. And that's when Atlantis rose. It was a civilization that tried to preserve the light, but ultimately became the pivot point of the fall. Atlantis was this last chance for integration and the redemption field I mentioned a moment ago. And I mentioned in a previous episode that Atlantis was the point of polarity flip. And I've mentioned the Earth experiment, but I haven't gone into this much depth or nuance, so this might be interesting. So, Atlantis was the turning point. And as the black hole field gained momentum before it actually flipped, Earth remained the host. It was a planetary womb holding both the distortion and the dormant codes of remembrance. So, within this womb or this coherence node of Earth, a civilization rose that would become both a beacon and a warning, and that was Atlantis. And Atlantis was not a myth, it was a real geographically part of Earth, but it was vibrationally distinct. I think I've said before that Atlantis was not actually on Earth, but I didn't go into this nuance. I didn't understand it at the time. So, Atlantis was a semi dimensional realm where spiritual, technological, and energetic intelligence reached a peak most modern societies can't yet comprehend. So, Atlantis was a bridge, and it was meant to be a bridge between higher dimensional knowledge and physical form, and between source aligned creation and the temptation of control. So you could really view Atlantis as an experiment within the Earth experiment, with the goal to try and reverse this downward spiral before polarity flipped into a black hole. So at its height, Atlantis was radiant. Temples resonated with crystal harmonics. Sacred geometry guided architecture, agriculture, and medicine. And the masculine and feminine worked in tandem. They were builders and priestesses, scientists and oracles, co creating in harmony with the earth's fields. But even within Atlantis, polarity was at play, and a split began to form between those who honored the original codes of embodiment and those who sought power through manipulation of energy and matter. And this wasn't about good versus evil, it was about remembrance versus inversion. I think that's really important to remember. Some Atlanteans began experimenting with technologies that bypassed the organic path of ascension, tech that siphoned energy, distorted frequency, and created artificial timelines. And others tried to warn them, but it was too late. The Atlantean fall wasn't a single event. It was a gradual unraveling of coherence until the grid itself fractured. But what followed was a series of cataclysms, earthquakes, floods, and an energetic collapse. Because what was seeded during the fall, the misuse of crystal technology, the suppression of the feminine, the distortion of sacred geometry, didn't die when Atlantis fell. That spread. And think of what happens when a very high level of technology falls into the hands of people with lower consciousness. That can be really devastating. You need your level of consciousness to match that level of technology so you use it in correct and ethical ways. The fallen Atlanteans scattered across the globe, bringing both light and shadow with them. Some tried to preserve the Gnosis, and others continued the agenda of control, and Earth entered a new epoch of density. So you could say Atlantis was Earth's last stabilizing node, a civilization high enough in frequency to keep the planetary spiral from fully tipping. Its vibrational resonance acted like a buoy, holding Earth just above the threshold. But when Atlantis fell, when its coherence broke and its inversion took hold, Earth lost its anchor. And when the stabilizing node collapses, the spiral accelerates. And that's exactly what happened. Without Atlantis maintaining that bridge between heaven and earth, the spiral of polarity turned inward. Fear replaced trust, hierarchy replaced harmony, technology overtook intuition, and the black hole field gained enough strength to flip the system. And this isn't just metaphorically, we're talking about structurally, energetically, and even cosmically. So I mentioned something about this before, but now I understand much deeper nuance. The entire universe that Earth is in didn't collapse, but the local quadrant connected to Earth's experiment, including parts of Orion, Sirius B, and Pleiadian networks, became entangled in the distortion. The fall of Earth wasn't isolated. It sent reverberations outward, rippling through the ley lines, memory grids, and energetic circuits of nearby realms. So some were overtaken, and they were hijacked through entropic technologies, parasitic consciousness, and artificial frequency manipulation. We talked about this in the architecture of distortion. And then others made a conscious choice. Certain higher dimensional beings and soul lineages who could have just stayed in their realm and stayed in harmony actually chose to dim their light temporarily. And this wasn't because they were overtaken, but because they refused to abandon Earth. So, what I mean by dim their light is they lowered their frequency intentionally, entering the field of density to remain close to us, embedding guidance in the land, in the stars, in the body. And this is why so many starseeds, indigenous wisdom holders, and DNA coded bloodlines carry memories of elsewhere. It's because their origins are not of the fall, but their love brought them into it. So while higher harmonics remained intact in many regions of the universe, this pocket of the spiral, our galactic neighborhood, became the densest node of distortion, and Earth became the epicenter. It's the place where both the hijack took root and where the remembering would begin. And that's why Earth holds so much weight, because if it can be healed here, if the spiral can be realigned at the lowest point, that healing ripples outward to every distorted node it once affected. So now let's talk about after the fall and when infiltration begins. When Atlantis collapsed, Earth's frequency fell below a vibrational threshold. Its grid that once resonated in coherence fractured, and polarity officially flipped into a black hole inversion. That fracture didn't just open physical instability, it opened dimensional rips, portals between realms. But here's the nuance: this didn't create darkness, it allowed existing inversion to enter Earth's fields. Realms like Orion, Draco, and parts of even Sirius and the Pleiades had already begun to fall long before Atlantis, They were in the quadrant of this universe that was taking part in this experiment or program. While Earth was still a coherence node and Atlantis a last ditch attempt to prevent further fall, other realms were already declining into inversion. Certain lineages had disconnected from source, collapsed into entropy, and learned to siphon light instead of generate it. These beings were already looking for access points, and once Earth's frequency dropped, the doorway appeared. So some entered through portals and wormholes, others bred with Earth women, seeding hybrid bloodlines like the Nephilim. Others worked subtly, embedding distortion into religion, law, language, and power systems. And this wasn't random, it was strategic, slow, and spiritual. But even as the light dimmed, the original codes were never lost. They were buried in the body, in the land, and in the DNA, waiting to be remembered. And this is what we'll be weaving all throughout the series. Now let's talk about the Nephilim, the first wave of hybrid distortion. The Nephilim are often remembered through distorted religious texts as giants or fallen angels, but their origin is far more complex. They were the result of genetic interbreeding between off planet races and Earth women, often without consent and often driven by an agenda. And these were not unions of sacred union and love. They were attempts to seed distortion into the human bloodline to hybridize the divine template with fallen frequency. And their goal was to corrupt the DNA and dismantle divine sovereignty from the inside out. And many Nephilim lineages were giant in stature, but the real impact wasn't physical, it was energetic, carrying fields of manipulation, dominance, psychic control, and even timeline corruption. These hybrid beings operated as intermediaries, part Earth, part off worlds. They were used to infiltrate communities, control knowledge, distort natural order, and prepare humanity for the next phase of hijack. So then enter the Anunnaki, the architects of control. The Anunnaki are a group of beings whose origin traces to a system associated with Nibiru. And that's a rogue planet or orbital body. Like the Pleiadians, they are not all good or evil. There are factions. But a dominant faction of the Anunnaki aligned with the black hole field early on and became major players in Earth's manipulation. Their role was more strategic and architectural. They didn't just manipulate people, they rewired systems. Here's what the hijacking Anunnaki factions are known for: genetic experimentation on both humans and animals, installation of false gods and ruler cults, introduction of hierarchical governance models like kingship and empire, control of fertility, resources, and agriculture through manipulation, initiating worship systems where humans gave power to external beings. They worked in close alliance with other inverted factions from Orion and Draco sectors, creating what some call the Babylonian control grid, a metaphysical and societal overlay that shaped much of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and early civilization. Ultimately, these beings had fallen from source connection themselves. They lacked access to life force energy and became parasitic, needing to feed on others to sustain their consciousness. And they craved what humans uniquely possessed: creative generative power, emotional and energetic range, a divine multidimensional template of DNA linked to source. Earth became a resource planet, but not for minerals alone. It became a resource planet for soul energy, reproductive control, and timeline engineering. Through Nephilim seeding and Anunnaki manipulation, certain bloodlines were established. These were genetic lines that carried both distortion and power. And these bloodlines were placed into positions of authority. Pharaohs, kings, emperors. They were taught arcane, which are inverted versions of spiritual law. They became the ancestors of what we now call the 13 bloodlines, many of which trace back to the regions of Babylon, Canaan, and Sumer. And through intergenerational secrecy, these lineages retained access to occulted knowledge, and not to liberate humanity, but to maintain control. But let's be very clear. Energy alchemy, sacred geometry, vibrational medicine, and occulted knowledge are not inherently dark. These are tools, blueprints of how energy flows, how form takes shape, how the universe organizes itself. What makes them light or dark isn't the knowledge itself, but the intention behind its use. The hijack didn't just steal the tools, it rewrote the story around them. It framed sacred teachings as evil, it cast wise women as witches, and painted the path of energetic mastery as forbidden, all to keep humanity disempowered and afraid of its own potential. But these tools were never meant to be hoarded. They were meant to be shared, and they were meant to help us remember our connection to God, to the earth, and to each other. And the more we share this and remember this and rewrite history, the spiral begins to reverse, and we can reclaim the truth and reclaim what once was hidden. And we can restore the original blueprint. So let's back up to when I'm talking about these different races and lineages. It's really important to remember that there were beings within these races, lineages, and timelines who refused the inversion. There were Pleiadians who stayed pure. There were Anunnaki who tried to warn. And there were Nephilim offspring who held pain and guilt and chose to heal. This is not a story of villainizing races. It's about understanding the architecture of distortion so we can dismantle it. So in the episodes on the architecture of distortion, I talked a lot about the archonic grid. So now let's weave that in. While the Nephilim marked the first wave of physical genetic interference, the deeper entrapment came through a more insidious force, the archons. Unlike the Nephilim, the archons were not embodied in flesh. They are non-physical, parasitic entities, consciousness forms born of separation, unable to generate life force on their own. They feed off dissidence, and their goal was simple: keep humanity disconnected from source, confused about truth, and looping in fear. So where the Nephilim work through bloodlines, the archons work through thought forms like shame, guilt, division, false spiritual hierarchies, inverted light teachings, and separation from the body. They projected into the astral and mental fields, crafting subtle distortions that sounded true but weren't. They posed as gods, guides, and messengers, seeding control-based spiritual systems that replaced direct gnosis with dogma. And this is how the hijack became self-replicating. The archons implanted inverted thought forms. The Nephilim grounded those inversions into institutions and lineages. And humanity, unaware of the interference, began running those codes, generating the energetic currency the archons needed to survive. This wasn't just spiritual confusion. It became an energetic economy of distortion. And unless one remembered how to reconnect directly to source, to bypass the system entirely through embodiment and inner truth, they would remain inside the loop. That's why this isn't just a story about ancient beings. It's a map of how consciousness itself was hijacked and how the choice to embody truth now becomes a radical act of reclamation. So now let's swing back and talk about why the Nephilim mated with women. So this is one of the deepest distortions in this entire hijack, and it was all biological. Because when you want to rewrite a species, you go to the womb. You go to the feminine body, especially in its fully activated, source connected state. That is one of the most powerful interfaces in the cosmos. It's not just a vessel for reproduction, it's a portal. It's a portal to lineage, life force, soul coding, and memory. The ancient feminine body carried crystalline DNA strands tuned to the divine blueprint. In her natural, sovereign state, the awakened feminine was a living stargate. Her womb knew how to weave new souls into alignment with Source. She was the original custodian of Gnosis, receiving direct guidance not from the priests or any intermediaries, but from God through her own blood, breath, and knowing. So, if you wanted to sever humanity from that direct line of communication, if you wanted to hijack the entire species from the inside out, you would begin where life begins, inside her. This is why the Nephilim and later factions like the Anunnaki and Draco hybrids targeted Earth women for genetic interbreeding. Like I said, this was not a sacred union. It was a takeover of the human line through the most potent portal available. By inserting distortion directly into the womb, they could corrupt the genetic expression, disrupt the organic codes of memory, create hybrid children whose nervous systems were more susceptible to control, and fracture the feminine's relationship to her own body and power. And over time, this distortion did more than alter DNA. It broke the intuitive bridge between body and source. When the feminine body was distorted, when the womb became a site of trauma instead of creation, the river of Gnosis began to dry up. Women forgot their power. Men forgot how to revere it. And slowly, the external systems of control replaced the inner knowing that once guided all of humanity. This is why so much of the hijack focused on vilifying the body, especially the female body. It's why blood became shameful, why sensuality became sinful, why feminine wisdom was burned, silenced, and buried. Because the hijackers knew the fastest way to sever humanity from God was to fracture the feminine from her own womb. But she is remembering now. And the moment that remembrance returns, when the feminine body reawakens to its sacred design, the blueprint begins to regenerate. Now let's talk about the rise of the patriarchy. So, once the feminine body was severed from her own knowing, and once the womb became a site of control rather than creation, a larger inversion unfolded across the collective. The rise of the patriarchy wasn't simply a social shift, it was a spiritual reprogramming. It marked the externalization of authority, the extraction of power from the inner temple to the outer throne. So you see, in source-aligned civilizations before the fall, masculine and feminine energies danced in sacred polarity, and that is polarity in divine balance. These source-aligned civilizations did not operate on hierarchy. The masculine did not dominate the feminine. It served it as a protector, stabilizer, and action in devotion to divine wisdom. The feminine didn't control the masculine. It guided it as intuitive compass, life giver, and oracle of God's unfolding. But once the womb was hijacked and gnosis severed, this polarity collapsed into power imbalance. The feminine, now disconnected from her own source stream, became easier to suppress, and the masculine, stripped of its anchoring counterpart, turned inwardly unstable and outwardly controlling. So here's what followed: goddess cultures were dismantled, priestess lineages were burned, erased, or absorbed into male priesthoods. Matriarchy led societies were overwritten by kingship and bloodline rule. Intuition and emotion were labeled irrational. Fertility and sexuality were controlled by temple law and state decree. The divine was renamed father, and the mother was erased. This wasn't true masculinity rising. It was distorted masculinity, masculinity unbalanced by its sacred counterpart. It became rulership instead of reverence, conquest instead of communion, dogma instead of gnosis, and discipline without devotion. And so began the era of power over rather than power with. What once was a spiral of mutual becoming became a pyramid of control. And again, this did not happen overnight. It was seeded over time through hybrid lineages placed in power, archonic thought forms shaping language, law, and religion, and the feminine forgetting her own origin, and the masculine forgetting how to hold reverence for the feminine. And yet, this was not the end of the story, because, like I've kept weaving in, these codes were never lost. They went underground and they went into the earth, into the bloodlines, and into the dreams and hearts of those who remembered. And now we are seeing the spiral turn again, and the feminine is rising, and the feminine is here to restore the sacred dance. I've been talking about this a lot on social media, but to have this balance of divine polarity, the feminine actually leads, and she steps into her gnosis, and the masculine follows. And this is the case within our own bodies as well, no matter which gender you are. To go back into coherence, no matter which gender you are, you need to learn how to let your feminine energy lead. And your divine feminine energy and your divine masculine energy need to be in balance and held in sacred and divine polarity. So, this is an interesting tidbit, but now let's talk about Noah's Ark and the Ark as a memory capsule. So, let's talk about one of the oldest stories carried across cultures and continents, the flood. So, most people know it through the biblical version, a God ordained flood to wipe out corruption, with Noah and his ark as the sole survivors. But here's the deeper truth: the flood narrative predates the Bible. It appears in Sumerian tablets, Mesopotamian myths, and indigenous oral traditions across the planet, from the Hopi to the Aboriginal Australians. So this begs the question, what was the flood actually about? Was it a punishment? Or was it an energetic reset, a last resort purification to clear distortion that had entered the field? Because, like we talked about, before the flood, something really had shifted. The earth was overrun with hybridization, manipulation, and spiritual interference. Ancient texts like the Book of Enoch speak of beings called the Nephilim, often interpreted as the offspring of the sons of gods and the daughters of men. At its core, this describes a dimensional breach, a moment where inversion entered the earth plane and began tampering with the human blueprints. The divine design of humanity, rooted in gnosis, source coherence, and sacred embodiment, was being interfered with. And so the flood came. In many traditions, a great flood followed the fall, washing away a world that had fallen into inversion. The story of Noah's Ark is one such record. While often told as literal history, it encodes a deeper energetic truth: the attempt to preserve the original template amidst planetary collapse. The Ark wasn't just a boat, it was a frequency container, a vibrational capsule meant to hold the uncorrupted DNA, memory fields, and codes of coherence, while the rest of the Earth grid was submerged in distortion. The Ark is a symbol of what cannot be destroyed: the divine spark, the original template, the architecture of Gnosis. Some traditions suggest the Ark wasn't just built with wood and pitch. It was a resonance chamber designed with sacred geometry to hold the frequency of life through the storm. A Merkaba vessel, if you will, protecting not just species but the codes of remembrance. Noah was not just a man, he was a genetic steward. He wasn't chosen because he was morally perfect. He was chosen because he resonated with the original divine template. He was a lineage holder, and he was tasked with protecting the codes. The animals weren't just biological species, they symbolized the preservation of archetypal intelligence across dimensional domains. The image of animals entering the ark two by two has often been interpreted as a logistical detail, but it encodes something far more sacred: the preservation of divine polarity. Each pair represented the living mirror of masculine and feminine, the core architecture through which life expresses, multiplies, and remembers. Remember, I've been talking about this a lot, but polarity and sacred balance is what all of creation is. That is what creates. These weren't just male and female animals for reproduction, they were living archetypes, carriers of elemental, biological, and spiritual balance. The ark was more than survival, it was a microcosm of Eden, and it sheltered the law of balance that would be needed to rebuild it. When the flood waters receded, the earth was different. The vibrational grid had been cleansed but also fractured. Pre-flood civilizations like Atlantis were gone. Their crystalline technologies, their sacred geometries, their embodied gnosis, all lost. So what came after was not just rebuilding, it was reseeding. New cultures emerged, but with partial memory. The blueprint was no longer fully intact. And over time, the inversion began again. It started off subtly, but then became more systemic. Because darkness doesn't die through destruction, it just sits back and waits for us to forget. Forget our true divinity. The flood is not only a story of destruction, it's an archetype of soul preservation during global collapse. It reminds us that Source always safeguards the codes, even when distortion overwhelms the field. And within every fall, there is a remnant. There's a seed, there's a flame that cannot be put out. And that's where we are now. We are living in the echo of that remembrance. And the ark is no longer a boat. It's your body, your field, your inner template awaking to gnosis. It is you carrying forward the codes through your voice, your breath, and your frequency. And yes, the flood was real, and yes, the codes were preserved, and yes, you are part of the lineage that survived. You are the ark now. You're a frequency vessel, you are a living record, and you are a sacred remnant seated for this moment. You are here to reconnect to Gnosis and remember this truth: so the original blueprint can come alive again. So we talked about the Nephilim earlier, and they first appeared before the flood. Like I talked about, they are hybrid distortions seeded through dimensional breach. The flood was a reset attempt to cleanse their influence, but as the spiral teaches us, energy never disappears. While many were wiped out physically, the code survived, either through hidden bloodlines, second incursions, or strategic preservation. The Nephilim returned after the flood, embedded into bodies, into systems, into power structures, into empires, into the very architecture of control. So then began the next phase of the spiral. And this was not through physical wars or brute force, it was through ideology. Yeah, there was probably violence, but a lot of it was subtle through language, law, and spiritual distortion. And this is where we enter Babylon. The flood washed the earth, but Babylon rebuilt it. And they didn't rebuild it in truth, they rebuilt it into illusion. What was once inner gnosis became outer decree. What was once sacred union became hierarchy. What was once embodied truth became ritualized control. So now let's talk about Babylon, the blueprint of religious control. As the spiral of inversion deepened, Earth entered a new phase, one where control became codified, not just practiced. Inversion wasn't hidden, it became ritualized. And truth was no longer simply suppressed, it was replaced. And the epicenter of this next phase was Babylon. Babylon was more than an ancient city, it was a template. It was a metaphysical control grid that spread across empires, timelines, and traditions. It became the archetype for religion as domination rather than revelation. So here's how it worked. The archonic loop became a doctrine. The subtle psychic control seated by the archons was now formalized into sacred text, temple laws, and divine hierarchies. Instead of direct communion with Source, people were told they needed intermediaries, priests, prophets, kings. Instead of inner gnosis, they were given external commandments. God became a distant ruler, angry, jealous, punishing. The next way they did this is the masculine God replaces the cosmic womb. The Divine Mother, once honored as the source of all life, was cast out. The feminine became associated with temptation, impurity, and sin. Creation was now described as an act of masculine word and will, rather than a dance between polarities. And the next thing they did was sexuality and life force were severed. Womb wisdom, pleasure, and sacred sexuality were labeled dangerous. Temple rites, once used to initiate divine remembrance, were outlawed or distorted. The very body became suspect. Desire was shamed, pleasure was controlled, and life force energy was redirected into shame loops and worship systems that fed the inversion. So the next way Babylon took control is they made this narrative that the chosen were chosen by bloodline, not by integrity. Babylonian priest kings claimed divine mandate through lineage, often seeded by Nephilim or Anunnaki hybrids. Rulership was no longer based on frequency or wisdom, but on heredity, control, and alliance with the distortion field. And the next way was language was fractured to control perception. As the Tower of Babel myth reflects, A deliberate fragmentation of language and meaning took place. Words that once carried frequency based truth were split, manipulated, and confused. This cut humanity off from the vibrational architecture of sound and creation. It also severed shared memory across tribes and nations, making unity harder to reclaim. The next way they did was sacred geometry became a tool of inversion. The same codes once used to build coherence were now used to lock energy into form. Temples were designed to trap power, not circulate it. Grids were anchored to siphon energy through worship and ritual. What was once open became sealed. And it wasn't to protect anyone, it was to control and contain. This is how the Babylonian control grid spread through the merging of state, religion, and law, through inversion of truth into dogma, through the severing of body from soul, earth from heaven, and self from source. And even within Babylon, some people remembered. And even within the priesthood, some still guarded truth. Even within the distorted temples, hidden chambers held fragments of the original codes, waiting for the right time. And that time, as we'll see, would ripple into Egypt, into Greece, into Rome, eventually into a place called America. But next, we'll talk about Egypt and talk about the split between those who served the true light and those who used its symbols to rule. Egypt, light keepers and the shadow priesthood. After Babylon laid the foundation for spiritual control, the torch of influence passed to another great civilization, Egypt. But unlike Babylon, Egypt held a unique tension. It became a battleground of wisdom. It was a convergence point where two lineages ran parallel, those who remembered the light and those who sought to use its symbols to rule. Egypt is often romanticized, and rightly so. Its temples, pyramids, and initiatory schools encoded profound spiritual intelligence. But Egypt was not monolithic. It housed both truth and distortion, initiation and control, remembrance and inversion. Long before Egypt's dynastic period, the land was inhabited by wisdom lineages that carried Atlantean memory. These were priestesses, grid workers, and light keepers. Many descended from the pure remnants of Lemuria and Atlantis. They understood sacred geometry, resonance, and the art of embodied gnosis. Their temples were not places of worship, but of activation. And these initiates worked with the Merkaba in the light body, sound frequency and vibrational healing, stargate alignments and earth sky rituals, sacred union and sexual alchemy, living relationship with the divine feminine and masculine within. Many were trained in temples dedicated to Isis, Hathor, Thoth, and Maat, deities who weren't gods in the way we think, but archetypal guides for remembering divine law, cosmic order, and the harmony of life. And apologies if I really mispronounced those wrong. But as Egypt became more powerful, it also became more vulnerable. So let's talk about the rise of the shadow priesthood. In time, these light temples were infiltrated. Certain bloodlines carrying Nephilim or Anunnaki codes rose to power through kingship, conquest, and hidden alliances. A shadow priesthood emerged, and they wore the garments of initiation but carried the codes of inversion. They began to restrict spiritual knowledge to an elite class, redirect temple rituals to serve the energy of the elites, replace inner gnosis with external ritual, use sacred geometry for entrapment, not expansion, and split the masculine and feminine currents, suppressing the feminine temples. What began as a civilization of initiation became a machine of control. It was still wrapped in sacred symbols, but it was powered by distortion. This is how the inverted priesthood took hold. They didn't destroy the light, but they wear its mask. They adopted the same sigils, scripts, and sacred rites, but disconnected them from source. The divine feminine, once honored as co creator, was now reduced to a symbol and later erased. The masculine, once balanced through polarity, became rigid, hierarchical, and weaponized. And this phase of the spiral cemented the patriarchal grid. And it wasn't a natural order, it was a deliberate inversion. Next, we'll trace how the Egyptian priesthood's split energy migrated westward, first into Greece and then into Rome, where the final inversion would crystallize through the rise of empire and the formation of the Christian church. So now let's talk about from Egypt to Rome, the codification of inversion. As Egypt's priesthood fractured, the spiral of spiritual distortion didn't end, it migrated. The sacred sciences once held in temple halls were slowly extracted, fragmented, and carried into Greece, where they were reframed through philosophy and later absorbed by the expanding power of Rome. This wasn't a clean handoff of wisdom. It was a deliberate repackaging, a slow migration of light-coded knowledge into the hands of empires. Many Greek philosophers like Plato and others were initiates of Egyptian mystery schools. They didn't discover their teachings in isolation. They remembered them through travels and initiations in Egypt, Babylon, and older pre-flood cultures. But in Greece, these teachings were filtered through a masculine intellectual lens. The divine feminine was abstracted, embodiment was severed from spirit, and gnosis became philosophy, something to ponder, not to live. Instead of sacred union, we got reason. Instead of multidimensional embodiment, we got logic. Instead of the spiral, we got the linear line of progress. The feminine mysteries, the breath, the womb, the earth, the field, were demoted or erased entirely. And so, when Rome absorbed Greece, it didn't just take on its architecture and myths. It inherited a filtered version of the ancient blueprint, one that had already begun to tilt. And you could view Rome as the final hijack of the spiral. Rome didn't spiritualize, it militarized. It took the fragments of sacred knowledge and weaponized them into empire. Here's how the inversion crystallized. Divine authority was now assigned to emperors and Caesars, not intergnosis. Sacred law was replaced with Roman law, external, rigid, and punitive. Initiatory temples were shut down or absorbed into Roman control. The body became a site of shame, control, and punishment, not divine embodiment. Earth-based and feminine rites were outlawed and demonized. And then came the masterstroke of this deception. And I'll go quickly over it here just to tie it into what we're talking about. But in the next episode, we go deep into this. So then came Christianity and the Council of Nicaea when Gnosis was burned. In 325 AD, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. And it wasn't to clarify God's truth, it was to consolidate political power. So, some key moments of distortion include choosing which gospels were acceptable and which would be destroyed, declaring Jesus as the only Son of God, severing the template of Christ from collective potential, erasing Mary Magdalene, the feminine Christ, and sacred union from the record, rewriting resurrection as literal rather than symbolic of the spiral path of initiation, codifying sin, hierarchy, and punishment into spiritual law, and suppressing reincarnation in multidimensional teachings. What was once an embodied gnosis of light and spiral resurrection became a system of external salvation, patriarchal control, and spiritual fear. This is how Rome hijacked the Christ codes, by externalizing what was always meant to be awakened within through gnosis. And this is how the spiral inverted from mystery school to megachurch, from Sophia to suppression, from spiral resurrection to linear obedience. But as I've been weaving in, these codes were not lost. They went underground, kept alive by mystics, Gnostics, Essenes, Templars, Druids, and the sacred feminine herself. So, this is where we will end for this episode, but we'll go way deeper into this in part 2. In part 2 is titled The Gnosis They Tried to Burn. And like I mentioned, that will come out on Thursday. So I know this is a lot of really good information, and sometimes it might be hard to just listen. So this is just a reminder that I do post the episode transcriptions in the show notes, and that links to a podcast materials Google Drive. So I'm going on a vacation soon, and actually, this is how it all works, but that vacation is actually what led me to starting this and going down some of these different topics. So I'm thinking that trip will come with a lot of information for both the podcast and behind the scenes for Patreon. So I love you all and have a great week.